The first loose shingle clattered down from Elena Moreau's Victorian roof, just as the morning weather report crackled through Marcus Chen's truck radio. Hurricane Celeste, now a Category 2 storm, had shifted course overnight and was bearing down on their small coastal town of Millhaven with an estimated arrival in 36 hours. Marcus pulled his weathered pickup to the curb and watched the elderly woman below struggle with her garden hose, trying to secure loose outdoor furniture. At 73, Elena moved with the determined grace of someone who had weathered many storms, but her worried glances toward the roof revealed her growing concern. 80-year-old Sophia bounced in the passenger seat beside him, her school backpack already packed for what might be an extended stay at the emergency shelter. Her dark eyes followed her father's gaze to the Victorian house with its ornate trim and aging cedar shingles. "Daddy, is that lady going to be okay in the big storm?" she asked, pressing her small hand against the truck window. Marcus studied the roof with the practiced eye of someone who had spent the last 3 years learning every aspect of home repair and maintenance. Several shingles hung at dangerous angles, and he could see where the recent coastal winds had already begun their destructive work. The gutters sagged ominously, and water stains along the roofline suggested more serious structural concerns. "We should help her," Sophia continued, her voice carrying that innocent certainty that problems existed to be solved by caring people. Marcus nodded slowly, already calculating materials and time. The storm was coming whether they were ready or not. Marcus approached Elena's front gate with Sophia's hand tucked securely in his. The older woman looked up from wrestling with a stubborn patio umbrella, her silver hair escaping from beneath a faded sun hat. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the respectful tone he always used with his elders. "I couldn't help but notice your roof needs some attention before the storm hits. I'm Marcus Chun, and I do handyman work around town." Elena straightened, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "Oh my, yes. I've been so worried about those loose shingles. Do you really think you could help?" "I'm afraid I don't have much money to spare." Marcus nodded reassuringly. "I can work with whatever budget you have. The important thing is getting you safe before Celeste arrives." Just then, a sleek black BMW pulled into the driveway with an aggressive rumble. A man in his 40s emerged, his expensive suit and polished shoes immediately marking him as someone accustomed to wealth and authority. His eyes swept dismissively over Marcus's work clothes and scuffed boots. "Mom, what's going on here?" the man demanded, striding toward them with obvious irritation. "Richard, this is Marcus," Elena began. "He's offered to help with the roof before the storm." Richard's expression hardened as he studied Marcus with undisguised skepticism. "Mom, you can't trust these fly-by-night handymen who show up before storms. They prey on elderly people, charging outrageous prices for shoddy work." His voice dripped with condescension as he looked Marcus up and down. "We need real professionals, not some amateur with a toolbox." Marcus felt the familiar sting of judgment, but kept his expression neutral. "I understand your concern for your mother's safety," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I'm here." Richard scoffed, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Henderson Roofing. They're the only legitimate contractors in this area. But they're booked solid through next week," Elena interjected, wringing her hands. "I already tried calling them yesterday." "Then we'll wait," Richard declared. "Better to ride out the storm with a questionable roof than let some unqualified handyman make it worse." Sophia tugged on Marcus's sleeve, her young voice cutting through the tension. "Daddy, tell him about all the roofs you've fixed. Tell him about Mrs. Patterson's house that didn't leak anymore after you worked on it." Marcus gently squeezed his daughter's hand, a silent request for patience. He turned back to Elena, ignoring Richard entirely. "Ma'am, I'll leave my car with you. If you change your mind, call me. But don't wait too long. The storm won't wait for anyone's schedule." As they walked back toward the truck, Marcus could hear Richard's voice rising behind them. "Mom, I can't believe you'd even consider trusting our home to some random guy with a pickup truck." Elena's response was barely audible, but Marcus caught the worry in her tone. "Richard, what if Henderson can't come? What if the roof fails during the storm?" Sophia looked up at her father as they reached the truck. Why was that man so mean to you, Daddy? You're the best fixer in the whole town. Marcus lifted his daughter into her seat, choosing his words carefully. Some people judge others by what they see on the outside. Sweetheart, they don't always take time to learn who someone really is. 2 hours later, Elena's phone rang. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice calm and professional. Henderson Roofing won't be available until next Thursday, she explained, her voice tight with worry. Richard left for his office, but he made me promise not to hire anyone without his approval. Marcus understood the position she was in, but the weather reports were growing more urgent by the hour. Mrs. Moreau, I can at least do a safety inspection for free. That way you'll know exactly what you're dealing with before the storm hits. Elena agreed gratefully, and within 30 minutes Marcus had returned with Sophia and his ladder. As he climbed onto the Victorian's complex roofline, his movements were precise and methodical. He examined each section with the careful attention of someone who understood that a roof was more than just shingles and nails. Sophia sat on the front steps with Elena, chattering about her father's work. Daddy used to draw buildings before Mommy got sick, she said matter-of-factly. He has books with pictures of houses and big buildings. He knows all about making things strong so they don't fall down. Elena watched Marcus as he measured sections of the roof with a small notebook, sketching what appeared to be detailed diagrams. His movements showed none of the rushed carelessness she associated with hurried repair work. Instead, he worked with the systematic precision of someone who truly understood structural integrity. When Marcus climbed down, his expression was serious. Mrs. Moreau, you have some significant issues beyond just loose shingles. The support beams under your northeast corner are showing stress signs, and your flashing around the chimney has completely failed. He showed her his sketches, pointing out problem areas with technical accuracy that surprised her. Richard's BMW returned just as Marcus was explaining the structural concerns to his mother. Behind him came a white van marked Thompson Construction, and two men in hard hats emerged carrying clipboards and measuring tools. Perfect timing, Richard announced loudly. Mom, these are real professionals. Licensed contractors with insurance and proper credentials. The lead contractor, a burly man named Pete, barely glanced at Marcus before dismissing him entirely. You can pack up your tools now, buddy. The adults are taking over. Marcus gathered his notebook and sketches without protest, but Elena stepped forward. Wait, she said. Marcus found some serious problems with the support beams and the flashing. Maybe you should look at his notes. Richard laughed harshly. Mom, please. These men don't need amateur hour drawings from some handyman. They have real training and professional equipment. Pete nodded condescendingly. Lady, we appreciate the concern, but we don't need some weekend warriors guesswork. We'll do a proper assessment with actual instruments and engineering knowledge. Sophia watched from the porch steps, her small fists clenched as she heard the dismissive tone in their voices. Marcus placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, signaling her to stay calm. Look, Marcus said quietly, addressing Pete directly, I found some stress fractures in the northeast corner support structure. You might want to check the load-bearing capacity before you start any major work up there. Pete snorted. Thanks for the tip, but we know how to identify structural issues. We've been doing this for 15 years. Richard stepped between them, his voice dripping with superiority. We need professionals, not amateurs playing with people's safety. My mother's life depends on getting this right. By afternoon, the wind had picked up considerably and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Hurricane Celeste was ahead of schedule, now expected to make landfall in 18 hours instead of the predicted 36. Pete and his crew had been on Elena's roof for 3 hours, but their confident demeanor had gradually dissolved into frustrated confusion. The Victorian's original 1890s construction featured unusual beam configurations and custom metalwork that didn't match any standard roofing manual. Mom, what's taking them so long? Richard asked, pacing nervously as he watched the contractors huddled in discussion on the roof. Elena stood at her kitchen window, wringing her hands as she observed the men pointing at various sections and shaking their heads. They keep measuring the same areas over and over, she murmured. Pete climbed down from the roof, his earlier arrogance replaced by obvious concern. "Ma'am, we've got a problem. This old Victorian has some kind of custom engineering we've never seen before. The load distribution system doesn't follow modern building codes." "What does that mean?" Richard demanded. "It means we can't figure out which beams are actually supporting the roof structure," Pete admitted reluctantly. "If we remove the wrong supports during repair, the whole northeast section could collapse." Richard's face paled. "But you said you were professionals. You said you had 15 years of experience." "We do, but this is specialty architectural work," Pete replied defensively. "We need someone who understands historical building design and custom engineering solutions." Elena looked out at the darkening sky, then back at the contractors who had promised expertise they clearly didn't possess. The storm was coming whether they were ready or not. The first outer bands of Hurricane Celeste arrived with shocking intensity. Wind gusts of 60 miles per hour sent tree branches crashing into power lines, and the already loose shingles on Elena's roof began peeling away like old paint. Pete and his crew hastily packed their tools as the weather deteriorated. "We can't work in these conditions," he shouted over the howling wind. "It's not safe up there anymore." "But what about my mother's roof?" Richard yelled back, panic creeping into his voice as another section of shingles tore loose and clattered to the ground. "We'll come back after the storm passes," Pete replied, already heading for his van. "There's nothing we can do now." "You can't just leave," Richard protested desperately. "The whole roof is failing." "Sorry, but we're not risking our lives for any job," Pete called over his shoulder before driving away into the storm. Elena stood in her doorway, watching helplessly as more pieces of her roof disappeared into the violent wind. Water had already begun dripping through the ceiling in 3 different rooms, and the exposed areas were growing larger by the minute. Richard pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through his contacts until he found Marcus's number. His pride warred with his terror as he listened to the ringing, knowing his mother's safety hung in the balance. "Marcus," Richard said when the call connected, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I know what I said earlier, but we need help. The contractors left, and Mom's roof is coming apart. The whole house could be destroyed." There was a pause before Marcus responded, his tone steady despite the chaos. "I'll be right there." Marcus arrived within 15 minutes, his truck loaded with emergency supplies and heavy-duty tarps. Sophia waited safely at their neighbor's house, while Marcus assessed the deteriorating situation through the howling wind and driving rain. The damage was worse than Richard had described. Nearly a quarter of the northeast roof section had peeled away, exposing the underlying structure to the full fury of the hurricane. Water poured through multiple openings, and the compromised support beams groaned ominously under the shifting loads. "This is bad," Richard shouted over the storm, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by desperate fear. "Can you actually fix this?" Marcus studied the exposed framework with intense concentration, his trained eye immediately identifying the critical stress points and load-bearing elements that Pete's crew had failed to understand. The Victorians' original architects had used an innovative truss system that distributed weight in ways that defied conventional roofing wisdom. "Not fix," Marcus called back, his voice calm despite the chaos. "But I can stabilize it enough to get through the storm." He began pulling specialized equipment from his truck with systematic efficiency, including engineered brackets and reinforcement cables that Richard had never seen a handyman carry. Each tool seemed specifically chosen for this exact type of emergency structural work. "How do you know what to do?" Richard asked, watching in amazement as Marcus began implementing what appeared to be a complex engineering solution. Marcus paused in his work, rain streaming down his face. "Because I designed hurricane-resistant buildings for 15 years before I became the handyman you see today." Working with methodical precision despite the dangerous conditions, Marcus began implementing an emergency structural stabilization system that left Richard speechless. Using heavy-duty cables and engineered anchor points, he created a temporary framework that redistributed the failing roof's load across the Victorians' original support beams. "You design buildings," Richard shouted through the wind, struggling to process this revelation while watching Marcus work with obvious expertise. Marcus secured another cable before responding. Chen Architectural Solutions, he called back, specialized in coastal construction and hurricane-resistant design for 15 years. Richard stared in disbelief as Marcus pulled out a waterproof tablet and began calculating load specifications with the speed and confidence of someone who had performed these calculations thousands of times. This wasn't guesswork or handyman improvisation. This was advanced structural engineering. "What happened?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Marcus paused in his work, rain streaming down his face as painful memories surfaced. "My wife Sarah was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer 3 years ago. I spent 2 years fighting to save her instead of working. Lost my practice, lost everything except Sophia." The temporary framework was taking shape under Marcus's skilled hands, each connection point precisely engineered to handle the hurricane's devastating forces. Richard watched in growing amazement as the groaning roof structure gradually stabilized under the systematic reinforcement. "I became a handyman because I needed steady work close to home," Marcus continued. "Sophia needed stability after losing her mother, but the skills never left." Richard felt a crushing wave of shame as he realized the magnitude of his misjudgment. As Marcus completed the emergency stabilization system, Elena emerged from her house wrapped in a raincoat, her eyes wide with wonder as she witnessed the transformation. The groaning and creaking had stopped, replaced by the solid reassurance of properly engineered structural support. "Marcus," Elena called through the diminishing wind, "you saved my home. How'd you know exactly what to do?" Marcus climbed down from the roof, exhaustion evident in his movements but satisfaction in his eyes. "Mrs. Moreau, I spent 15 years designing buildings to withstand exactly these conditions. Your Victorian has beautiful original architecture that just needed proper understanding." Richard approached his mother and Marcus, his face etched with profound remorse. "I owe you an enormous apology," he said quietly. "I judged you completely wrong. You're not a handyman, you're an architect who happens to be working as a handyman." The distinction was lost on Elena, who simply saw a man who had risked his safety to protect her home. But Richard finally understood the difference between appearance and reality, between current circumstances and true capability. As word spread through the neighborhood about Marcus's expertise, other residents began approaching with their own storm damage concerns. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down had a collapsing porch overhang. The Johnson's chimney was listing dangerously. One by one, Marcus assessed each situation with the same professional competence that had saved Elena's Victorian. Richard watched in amazement as his mother's humble handyman revealed himself to be exactly the kind of expert their community desperately needed. The man he had dismissed as an opportunistic amateur was actually a master of his craft who had chosen service over status. Hurricane Celeste reached its full fury at midnight, battering the coastal town with winds exceeding 90 miles per hour and torrential rains that turned streets into rivers. But as dawn broke and the storm moved inland, the results of Marcus's emergency interventions became dramatically clear. Elena's Victorian stood proud and intact, its temporary reinforcement system having perfectly distributed the hurricane's massive forces across the original load-bearing structure. Not a single additional shingle had been lost during the storm's peak hours. Throughout the neighborhood, the homes Marcus had quickly assessed and reinforced showed similar resilience. Mrs. Patterson's porch remained secure despite the pounding winds. The Johnson's chimney stood straight and solid. Every structure that Marcus had touched with his engineering expertise had weathered the hurricane without significant damage. In stark contrast, several homes that had relied on conventional repairs or temporary fixes suffered catastrophic failures. Roofs collapsed, walls buckled, and entire sections of some houses were simply swept away by the storm's relentless power. Richard stood in Elena's yard surveying the neighborhood, finally comprehending the full scope of Marcus's expertise. The man he had dismissed as an unqualified handyman had literally saved dozens of homes and potentially lives through his advanced understanding of structural engineering and hurricane-resistant design. When Marcus arrived to check on Elena and assess the temporary reinforcements, Richard met him at the gate with tears in his eyes. "You didn't just fix Mom's roof," he said, his voice heavy with emotion and gratitude. "You saved this entire neighborhood. I was so completely wrong about you." 3 days after Hurricane Celeste passed, Richard found Marcus at Elena's house, carefully removing the temporary reinforcements and assessing the permanent repairs needed. The transformation in Richard's demeanor was gone was the arrogant dismissal, replaced by genuine respect and profound gratitude. "Marcus," Richard began, his voice steady but emotional, "I need to apologize for how I treated you. More than that, I need to make this right." Marcus looked up from his work, Sophia playing safely nearby in Elena's garden. "You don't owe me anything," he replied quietly. "I did what anyone would do." "No, Richard insisted. You did what an expert would do, what a master architect would do, and I was too blind and prejudiced to see it." Elena emerged from her house, carrying a tray of coffee, her face glowing with admiration for the man who had saved her home. "The whole neighborhood is talking about you, Marcus," she said warmly. "Everyone wants to know how you knew exactly what to do." Richard took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Marcus, I own a development company. We specialize in coastal construction, and after seeing your work, I realize we need someone with your expertise. Would you consider joining us as our lead structural engineer?" Marcus paused, considering the offer that would restore his professional status and provide better opportunities for Sophia's future. The handyman who had been dismissed as unqualified was being offered partnership in the very company whose owner had once called him an amateur. Throughout the neighborhood, word spread about Marcus's incredible hidden talents and the dramatic rescue of their homes. Have you ever discovered someone had amazing abilities when given the chance? Share your story in the comments below and tell us your favorite part of Marcus's journey.